Age 7. Your relationship with money was already damaged. Not by anything you did, not by any choice you made, but by invisible patterns passed down through generations like a secret language you learned without knowing you were learning it. Think about the last time you checked your bank balance. That feeling that washed over you, whether it was relief, anxiety, shame, or even guilt about having too much, that feeling was programmed into you before you could tie your shoes. In the next hour, you'll understand exactly why you make the financial decisions you do, why certain numbers feel safe while others trigger something primal and uncomfortable, why success sometimes feels dangerous, why you might sabotage your own progress just when things start going well. And it all starts with something that happened before you could even speak. There's a reason I call this the invisible inheritance. You'll understand why in a moment. Whether you're fully focused right now, or simply letting this play in the background while you work, rest, or drift to sleep, your subconscious mind is listening. The gentle frequencies woven into this audio are designed to quietly reprogram your relationship with money and abundance. So there's no need to concentrate. Just relax. Let the words and frequencies do their work. Your mind will absorb what it needs. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 34, earns 6 figures, has a healthy savings account, and by every external measure, she's financially successful. But Sarah has a problem. Every time her bank balance goes above a certain number, let's say $40,000, she finds a way to spend it down. Not on anything frivolous. Sarah's too responsible for that. She'll suddenly need car repairs, or she'll be unusually generous with gifts, or she'll make an investment that doesn't quite pan out. Always something reasonable. Always something that brings her balance back down to that comfort zone. Sarah came to understand this pattern when she learned about her grandmother, Elena. Elena lived through the Great Depression as a child. Her family lost everything: their farm, their savings, their sense of security. Elena learned that having too much was dangerous. It made you a target. It could all disappear overnight anyway. Elena never told Sarah these stories directly. In fact, Elena rarely spoke about money at all. But she passed something down anyway, through the way she flinched when Sarah's mother spent money on anything unnecessary, through the anxiety that crept into her voice when discussing the future, through the relief she showed when the family stayed modest, stayed small, stayed safe. What Sarah inherited wasn't just Elena's stories. According to emerging research in epigenetics, she may have inherited Elena's stress responses at a cellular level. The trauma of financial loss, encoded in Elena's DNA, passed down through generations like an invisible inheritance. This is the reality of generational wealth trauma. It's not just about the stories your family told you about money. It's about the stories they lived, the fears they carried, and the survival strategies they developed, all of which become part of your cellular programming before you're old enough to question them. The science of inherited trauma. We used to believe that trauma was purely psychological, something that lived in memories and behaviors passed down through learned patterns and family dynamics. But research over the past 2 decades has revealed something far more profound and unsettling. Trauma changes us at the genetic level, and those changes can be passed to our children and their children, affecting how they respond to stress, how they perceive safety, and yes, how they relate to money and security. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research with Holocaust survivors and their children revealed that the children of trauma survivors showed similar stress hormone patterns to their parents, even when they hadn't experienced the original trauma themselves. Their bodies were primed for danger that existed in their parents' past, not their present reality. The mechanism is called epigenetic inheritance. Environmental factors, like chronic stress, poverty, or trauma, can alter how genes are expressed without changing the DNA sequence itself. These alterations can then be passed to offspring, essentially programming them with their ancestors' survival responses. Think about what this means for money. If your grandparents lived through economic collapse, their bodies learned to associate financial security with temporary illusion. Their stress systems became hyper-vigilant around money, always scanning for signs that loss was imminent. And that hypervigilance, that cellular memory of financial trauma, may have been passed down to you. This isn't speculation. Studies of descendants of famine survivors show altered metabolism and stress responses generations later. Children of war survivors show heightened anxiety responses to situations their parents, not they, experienced. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. But here's what makes this particularly complex with money. Financial trauma doesn't just come from dramatic events like economic collapse or poverty. It can come from more subtle experiences that your ancestors might not have even recognized as traumatic. Consider the immigrant experience. Your great-grandparents may have left their homeland with nothing, rebuilt their lives through incredible sacrifice and frugality. The stress of starting over, of never feeling quite secure, of always being one step away from losing everything again. That stress shaped their relationship with money in ways they passed down unconsciously. Or consider the experience of sudden wealth loss. Maybe your family once had money and lost it through business failure, divorce, or economic downturn. The shock of that loss, the shame and fear that followed, becomes encoded in the family's cellular memory. Future generations inherit not just the story of that loss, but the body's response to it. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his research on trauma, describes how the body keeps the score. Traumatic experiences become stored in our nervous systems, affecting how we perceive and respond to the world. When this trauma is financial, it creates what we might call a money nervous system, a set of automatic responses to financial situations that operate below conscious awareness. Your money nervous system might cause you to feel anxious when you have too much money, as if abundance itself is dangerous. Or it might make you compulsively save, driven by a cellular memory of scarcity even when scarcity is no longer your reality. Or it might cause you to spend impulsively, as if money will disappear anyway, so you might as well enjoy it while you can. These aren't character flaws or personal failings. They're adaptive responses that once served a purpose in your family system. The problem is that they're operating on outdated information, responding to dangers that existed in your ancestors' world, but not necessarily in yours. The invisible programming. Understanding the science helps explain the mechanism, but to truly grasp generational wealth trauma, we need to understand how it operates in daily life. How does this invisible programming actually influence your financial decisions? It starts with what psychologists call implicit memory. Memories that influence behavior without conscious recall. You don't remember learning to be afraid of financial success, but the fear is there. You don't remember being taught that money is dangerous, but you feel the danger anyway. This programming often manifests as what I call financial comfort zones, ranges of wealth, income, or spending that feel safe and familiar. Step outside these zones, either up or down, and your nervous system activates, creating discomfort that drives you back to familiar territory. Consider Marcus, whose family had a pattern of boom and bust cycles. His grandfather made and lost fortunes multiple times in real estate. His father experienced similar cycles in his business ventures. Marcus grew up watching money come and go unpredictably, never knowing whether they'd be comfortable or struggling. As an adult, Marcus finds himself unconsciously recreating these cycles. He'll work intensely and save aggressively until he has a substantial cushion, then make impulsive financial decisions that bring him back to the edge of financial stress. It's not conscious self-sabotage. It's his nervous system returning him to the familiar rhythm of financial instability his body learned to expect. The programming also shows up in what researchers call money scripts, unconscious beliefs about money that drive behavior. These scripts are often passed down through generations like family heirlooms, except instead of inheriting grandmother's jewelry, you inherit grandmother's fear of not having enough. Dr. Brad Clontze's research identifies several common money scripts that families pass down. Money avoidance, the belief that money is corrupting or that good people shouldn't want wealth. Money worship, the belief that money will solve all problems and bring happiness. Money status, the belief that self-worth is determined by net worth. And money vigilance, the belief that money should be saved and spending is dangerous. Each of these scripts can be adaptive in certain circumstances. Money vigilance might have helped your ancestors survive periods of genuine scarcity. Money avoidance might have protected them from the corruption they witnessed in wealthy people around them. But when these scripts operate unconsciously in your life, they can limit your financial potential in ways you don't even recognize. The most insidious aspect of this programming is how normal it feels. You don't experience it as trauma or dysfunction. You experience it as common sense, as prudence, as just how things are. The voice in your head that says people like us don't make that kind of money, or it's selfish to want more, doesn't announce itself as inherited programming. It presents itself as wisdom, as morality, as truth. This is why traditional financial advice often fails to create lasting change. It addresses the conscious mind, teaching budgeting, investing, goal setting, while ignoring the unconscious programming that's actually driving financial behavior. You can learn all the right strategies, but if your nervous system is programmed to associate financial success with danger, you'll find ways to sabotage your progress. The programming also manifests in what psychologists call financial flashbacks, moments when current financial situations trigger responses that belong to your family's past, not your present reality. You might feel panic when your income fluctuates, even slightly, because your body remembers when income fluctuation meant survival was at stake. You might feel guilty about spending money on yourself, because your cellular memory associates self-care with selfishness or waste. These flashbacks can be triggered by specific amounts of money, certain types of financial decisions, or even conversations about wealth and success. Your body responds as if you're facing the same threats your ancestors faced, even when you're objectively safe and secure. The patterns we inherit. Generational wealth trauma doesn't just pass down randomly. It follows specific patterns, creating recognizable themes that repeat across generations until someone becomes conscious enough to interrupt them. One of the most common patterns is what I call the scarcity inheritance. This typically originates with ancestors who experience genuine material deprivation, poverty, famine, economic collapse, or forced displacement. The survival strategies they developed around hoarding, extreme frugality, or mistrust of abundance become encoded in the family system. Descendants of scarcity inheritance often struggle with what psychologists call wealth guilt, the feeling that having money is somehow wrong or dangerous. They may unconsciously limit their earning potential, give away money compulsively, or create financial crises that return them to familiar scarcity. But here's what's particularly interesting. Scarcity inheritance doesn't always create poor people. Sometimes it creates wealthy people who can never enjoy their wealth. They accumulate money compulsively, but can't spend it on themselves. They achieve financial success, but continue living as if poverty is just around the corner. Their bank accounts grow, but their nervous systems remain stuck in survival mode. Another common pattern is boom and bust inheritance. This comes from families who experience dramatic financial swings, periods of wealth followed by periods of loss. Maybe they were wealthy landowners who lost everything in war or revolution. Maybe they were business owners who experienced multiple cycles of success and failure. People with boom and bust inheritance often recreate these cycles unconsciously. They'll build wealth, then make decisions that destroy it, then rebuild it again. It's not conscious self-sabotage. It's their nervous system returning to the familiar rhythm of financial instability. Stability, paradoxically, feels unstable because it's unfamiliar. A third pattern is wealth shame inheritance. This typically comes from families where money was associated with moral corruption, where wealth was seen as evidence of greed or lack of spiritual development. Maybe they were raised in religious traditions that glorified poverty, or they witnessed wealthy people behaving badly and concluded that money corrupts. Descendants of wealth shame inheritance often struggle with what researchers call upper limit problems, unconscious mechanisms that prevent them from exceeding their family's implicit wealth ceiling. They might sabotage opportunities, undercharge for their services, or give away money to avoid the guilt of having too much. Then there's financial invisibility inheritance. This comes from families where money was never discussed, where financial decisions were made in secret, where children were kept completely separate from financial reality. The message, usually unintended, was that money is too dangerous, complex, or adult for them to understand. People with financial invisibility inheritance often struggle with basic money management as adults, not because they lack intelligence, but because they inherited a nervous system response that treats money as fundamentally mysterious and dangerous. They may avoid financial planning, delegate all money decisions to others, or feel overwhelmed by even simple financial tasks. Each of these patterns served a purpose in the family system where it originated. Scarcity inheritance helped families survive genuine material threats. Boom and bust inheritance prepared families for unpredictable economic environments. Wealth shame inheritance protected families from the social dangers of appearing too prosperous. Financial invisibility inheritance shielded children from financial stress and anxiety. The problem isn't that these patterns existed. They were adaptive responses to real circumstances. The problem is when they continue operating in circumstances where they're no longer needed, limiting possibilities that didn't exist when the patterns were formed. Dr. Murray Bowen's research on family systems shows how patterns can persist across generations through what he calls emotional transmission. Families unconsciously train each generation to carry forward the emotional responses of previous generations, creating what amounts to a multi-generational nervous system. This transmission happens through countless micro-interactions. The way parents' voices change when they discuss money, the tension that appears in their bodies when bills arrive, the relief or anxiety they show around financial decisions. Children absorb these emotional patterns before they understand what money even is. But perhaps the most powerful transmission mechanism is what happens when families don't talk about money at all. The silence itself becomes the message. Children learn that money is too dangerous, too complex, or too shameful to discuss openly. They inherit not just financial patterns, but the emotional charge around those patterns. The neurobiology of money trauma. To understand how generational wealth trauma operates, we need to understand what happens in your brain when financial stress activates inherited trauma responses. This isn't just psychology, it's neurobiology, involving specific brain structures and chemical processes that operate below conscious awareness. When your ancestors experienced financial trauma, their brains adapted in ways designed to help them survive. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, became hypervigilant to financial threats. The hippocampus, which processes memory and context, began encoding money-related experiences with heightened emotional intensity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, learned to defer to more primitive survival responses when financial stress appeared. These adaptations were passed down not just through learned behavior, but through epigenetic changes that altered how genes related to stress response, memory formation, and threat detection are expressed. Your brain inherited a financial threat detection system calibrated to dangers your ancestors faced, not necessarily the ones you face. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on the triune brain helps explain how this affects your financial decision-making. When inherited trauma responses are activated, your reptilian brain, focused on survival, takes control from your mammalian brain, focused on connection and care, and your neocortex, focused on rational analysis. This is why you might make financial decisions that seem irrational in retrospect. Your rational brain knows that investing in your business makes sense, but your reptilian brain, operating on inherited programming, perceives risk-taking as dangerous. Your rational brain knows you can afford that vacation, but your survival brain, carrying cellular memories of scarcity, triggers guilt and anxiety about wasteful spending. The neurobiology becomes even more complex when we consider how different types of financial trauma create different neural patterns. Acute financial trauma, like sudden bankruptcy or job loss, tends to create hypervigilant responses. Your brain becomes constantly scanning for signs that financial disaster is imminent, even when you're objectively secure. Chronic financial stress, on the other hand, tends to create what researchers call learned helplessness responses. If your ancestors experienced prolonged periods where their financial efforts didn't improve their situation, your brain may have inherited a pattern of giving up on financial goals before you've really tried to achieve them. Dr. Stephen Porges' research on the polyvagal nervous system reveals another layer of complexity. Financial trauma can dysregulate the vagus nerve, which controls your body's rest and digest responses. When this system is dysregulated by inherited trauma, you might feel anxious or activated even when your finances are stable, or conversely, you might feel numb and disconnected from financial reality as a protective mechanism. This neurobiological inheritance explains why financial triggers can feel so overwhelming and irrational. When something activates your inherited trauma responses, maybe it's a certain dollar amount, a type of financial decision, or even just thinking about money, your nervous system responds as if you're facing the same threats your ancestors faced. Your heart rate increases. Stress hormones flood your system. Your thinking becomes narrow and focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Your body prepares for fight, flight, or freeze responses that were appropriate for your ancestors' circumstances, but may be completely inappropriate for yours. The good news is that understanding this neurobiology also points towards solutions. The same neuroplasticity that allowed trauma responses to be encoded can allow them to be rewired. But this rewiring requires more than just conscious intention. It requires working with your nervous system directly. Traditional therapy often focuses on changing thoughts and beliefs about money. But if the trauma is encoded at a neurobiological level, thinking your way out of it has limited effectiveness. You need approaches that work with your nervous system, somatic therapy, breathwork, meditation, movement practices, to literally rewire the neural pathways that carry inherited trauma responses. This is why affirmations and positive thinking often fail to create lasting financial change. You can tell yourself, "I deserve wealth," all you want, but if your nervous system is programmed to associate wealth with danger, your body will find ways to sabotage your financial progress, no matter what your conscious mind believes. The rewiring process requires what trauma specialists call titrated exposure, gradually exposing your nervous system to financial situations that trigger inherited responses, but in doses small enough that you can stay present and regulated. Over time, this teaches your nervous system that these situations are actually safe in your current reality, even if they weren't safe in your ancestors' reality. Breaking the cycle. Understanding generational wealth trauma is only the first step. The real work lies in breaking the cycle, interrupting the unconscious transmission of inherited financial patterns, and creating new possibilities for yourself and future generations. This work begins with what trauma specialists call developing a witness consciousness the ability to observe your financial patterns and responses without being completely identified with them. Instead of "I am someone who can't handle money," you learn to recognize "I am someone experiencing inherited responses around money." This shift might seem subtle, but it's profound. When you recognize that your financial patterns aren't personal failures but inherited adaptations, you create space for curiosity instead of judgment. You can begin investigating these patterns as if you're an anthropologist studying your own family system, rather than a defendant trying to justify your behavior. The next step involves what I call financial archaeology, carefully excavating the stories, traumas, and survival strategies that created your inherited patterns. This isn't about blame or victimization. It's about understanding the logic behind patterns that might seem irrational in your current context. Start by mapping your family's financial history across at least 3 generations. What major financial events shaped your grandparents' and parents' relationships with money? Economic depressions, wars, immigrations, business failures, sudden windfalls, divorces, any event that significantly impacted the family's financial security. But don't just collect facts. Pay attention to the emotional residue around these events. How does your family talk about money, if they talk about it at all? What happens to the energy in the room when financial topics arise? What beliefs about money, success, and security get transmitted through stories, jokes, warnings, and silences? Notice the patterns that repeat across generations. Does your family have a history of financial boom and bust cycles? Do successful family members tend to experience guilt or self-sabotage? Are there implicit rules about how much success is acceptable, or what types of wealth are morally permissible? As you do this archaeological work, you'll likely notice that your nervous system responds to certain discoveries. You might feel anxiety when you uncover stories of financial loss, or guilt when you recognize patterns of wealth avoidance. These responses are information. They show you where inherited trauma is still active in your system. The healing work happens at the intersection of understanding and embodied experience. It's not enough to intellectually understand your patterns. You need to feel them in your body and gradually teach your nervous system new responses. This is where somatic approaches become essential. Somatic therapy, developed by practitioners like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk, works directly with the nervous system to discharge trapped trauma energy and create new neural pathways. When applied to financial trauma, these approaches can help you literally rewire your relationship with money. One powerful somatic technique is called pendulation, gently moving your attention between states of financial activation and states of calm. You might think about a financial goal that triggers anxiety. Notice where you feel that anxiety in your body. Then shift your attention to something that helps you feel grounded and safe. By moving back and forth between activation and regulation, you gradually increase your nervous system's capacity to handle financial stress without going into fight, flight, or freeze responses. Over time, this expands what trauma therapists call your window of tolerance, the range of financial experiences you can handle while staying present and grounded. Another crucial element is what I call reparenting your financial self. Much of our financial programming was installed when we were children, absorbing our family's emotional responses to money before we had the capacity to evaluate them consciously. Healing requires offering your inner child the financial security and wisdom that may have been missing from your early environment. This might involve literally speaking to the part of yourself that carries inherited financial fears. I understand you learned that money is dangerous, and that made sense in our family's history. But I want you to know that we're safe now. I'm going to make financial decisions from wisdom, not from fear, and I'll always make sure we're taken care of. The reparenting process also involves gradually exposing yourself to financial experiences that your family system taught you to avoid. If your family inheritance includes wealth guilt, you might practice receiving money, spending money on yourself, or setting higher prices for your services, but in small, manageable doses that don't overwhelm your nervous system. If your inheritance includes scarcity patterns, you might practice what trauma therapists call resourcing, actively noticing and appreciating the abundance that already exists in your life, training your nervous system to recognize safety and sufficiency rather than constantly scanning for threats. Rewriting your money story. Breaking generational patterns isn't just about healing trauma. It's about consciously creating new patterns that serve your authentic desires rather than your inherited fears. This requires what I call authoring your own money story, taking conscious control of the financial narrative that will guide your life and potentially influence future generations. Traditional goal setting often fails because it tries to impose new behaviors on top of old programming. It's like trying to build a house on an unstable foundation. The structure might look good initially, but it won't last when stress tests come. Rewriting your money story requires first stabilizing the foundation by healing inherited trauma, then consciously designing the financial life you want to create. This process begins with what psychologists call values clarification, identifying what actually matters to you about money and wealth, separate from what you inherited from your family system. This is more complex than it might seem, because inherited patterns often masquerade as personal values. You might think you value frugality, for example, when what you've actually inherited is a nervous system that associates spending with danger. Or you might think you don't care about money, when what you've inherited is shame around wanting financial success. Distinguishing between authentic values and inherited programming requires honest self-examination and often professional support. One powerful exercise is to imagine you're the first person in your family lineage, that you have no inherited beliefs, fears, or patterns around money. From this blank slate, what would you want your relationship with money to look like? What would feel authentic and aligned with your deepest values? This isn't about rejecting everything from your family inheritance. Some of what you inherited may be genuinely valuable. The goal is conscious choice rather than unconscious repetition. You want to keep the parts of your financial inheritance that serve you while releasing the parts that limit you. The rewriting process also involves what narrative therapists call reauthoring, consciously crafting new stories about money that support the life you want to create. Instead of money as the root of all evil inherited, you might choose money as a tool for creating positive impact. Instead of people like us don't get wealthy inherited, you might choose I can create wealth while staying true to my values. But new stories aren't enough by themselves. They need to be embodied through consistent action and nervous system regulation. Your body needs evidence that these new stories are safe and true, not just intellectually appealing concepts. This is where what I call micro-experiments become crucial. Rather than making dramatic financial changes that might trigger inherited trauma responses, you make small experiments that gradually expand your financial comfort zone while keeping your nervous system regulated. If you're working with wealth guilt, you might start by spending $5 on something purely for your own pleasure, paying attention to any guilt or anxiety that arises, and practicing self-compassion around those feelings. If you're working with scarcity patterns, you might practice expressing gratitude for small abundances in your life, training your nervous system to notice sufficiency rather than lack. These micro-experiments serve multiple purposes. They provide your nervous system with new experiences that contradict old programming. They build confidence in your ability to handle financial situations that previously felt overwhelming. And they create what psychologists call corrective emotional experiences, positive associations that begin to outweigh inherited negative associations. The rewriting process also requires developing what trauma specialists call dual awareness, the ability to simultaneously hold your inherited patterns and your chosen direction. You don't try to eliminate inherited responses entirely. That's usually impossible and often counterproductive. Instead, you learn to recognize them when they arise and choose how to respond. I notice I'm feeling anxious about this investment opportunity. That's my inherited scarcity programming being activated. I can acknowledge that fear without letting it make my decisions for me. What would be a wise choice for my current reality rather than my family's past reality? This dual awareness prevents the common trap of trying to positive think your way out of inherited patterns. You're not denying or suppressing the old programming. You're developing the capacity to work with it consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. Perhaps most importantly, rewriting your money story involves developing what I call financial self-compassion, the ability to treat yourself with kindness and understanding as you navigate this complex healing process. Inherited trauma patterns didn't develop overnight, and they won't heal overnight either. There will be times when old patterns resurface despite your best efforts. Times when you make financial decisions from fear rather than wisdom. Times when you feel frustrated with your progress or discouraged by setbacks. These experiences aren't failures, they're normal parts of the healing process. Financial self-compassion means treating these moments as opportunities for learning rather than evidence of personal inadequacy. Of course, I reverted to old patterns. I was stressed, and my nervous system defaulted to familiar responses. What can I learn from this experience? How can I support myself better next time? The ripple effect. When you begin healing generational wealth trauma, you're not just changing your own life. You're potentially altering the trajectory of your entire family lineage. The patterns you interrupt won't be passed down to future generations. The new patterns you create become part of your family's inheritance instead. This ripple effect often begins before you even have children of your own. As you develop a healthier relationship with money, family members around you may notice changes in how you talk about finances, how you handle financial stress, and how you make financial decisions. Your nervous system regulation around money gives others permission to examine their own inherited patterns. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on interpersonal neurobiology shows how nervous system states are contagious. When you're regulated and grounded around financial topics, that regulation influences the nervous systems of people around you. Family gatherings where money used to create tension may become more relaxed. Conversations about financial planning that used to be avoided may become possible. But the ripple effect goes deeper than just modeling healthier behavior. Epigenetic research suggests that healing trauma can actually reverse some of the genetic expressions that carry trauma forward. When you regulate your nervous system and heal inherited patterns, you may be changing the genetic inheritance you pass to future generations. This doesn't mean your children will be born with perfect relationships with money. They'll still absorb patterns from the culture around them and create their own responses to life experiences. But they won't inherit the specific trauma responses that have been passed down through your family lineage. The healing process also creates what family systems therapists call earned security. Even if you inherited insecure attachment patterns around money and resources, you can develop secure patterns through conscious healing work. These earned secure patterns can then be passed to your children, breaking cycles of financial insecurity that may have persisted for generations. Consider Maria, whose family carried patterns of financial boom and bust for 3 generations. Her great-grandfather lost his business during the Depression. Her grandfather rebuilt wealth, but lost it again in a divorce. Her father experienced similar cycles of financial success followed by dramatic losses. Maria began noticing her own tendency to sabotage financial success, just as things were going well. Through therapy and somatic work, she traced this pattern back to her family's inherited belief that sustainable wealth was impossible, that success inevitably led to loss. As Maria healed these patterns, she began making different financial choices. Instead of the dramatic swings between wealth and loss that characterized her family history, she built steady, sustainable prosperity. Her nervous system learned to tolerate ongoing success without creating crises to return to familiar territory. But perhaps more importantly, Maria's young daughter grew up witnessing a completely different relationship with money. Instead of the anxiety and instability that had characterized previous generations, she absorbed patterns of financial calm and steady abundance. The boom and bust inheritance that had shaped Maria's family for generations stopped with Maria. This is the profound possibility that healing generational wealth trauma offers, not just personal transformation, but generational transformation. The work you do to heal inherited patterns becomes a gift to future generations who won't have to carry the same limitations. The ripple effect also extends beyond your immediate family to your broader community and professional relationships. As you develop a healthy relationship with money, you may find yourself making different career choices, setting different boundaries around compensation, or approaching business relationships from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. These changes can influence entire professional ecosystems. When you price your services based on value rather than inherited guilt, you give others permission to do the same. When you negotiate from a place of worth rather than desperation, you model different possibilities for everyone involved in the negotiation. The healing work also often reveals hidden gifts within your family lineage. The same sensitivity that made your ancestors vulnerable to financial trauma may also carry gifts of intuition, creativity, or empathy that can be tremendous assets in creating wealth when they're no longer constrained by inherited fears. The frugality that developed from scarcity inheritance might transform into conscious, values-based spending once it's no longer driven by fear. The caution that developed from boom and bust cycles might become wise risk assessment once it's no longer paralyzed by inherited trauma responses. This is why healing generational wealth trauma isn't about rejecting your family inheritance entirely. It's about transforming inherited survival strategies into conscious choices that serve your current reality and future possibilities. Integration and moving forward. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to understand that healing generational wealth trauma isn't a destination you arrive at, but an ongoing process of conscious relationship with your inherited patterns and chosen direction. The goal isn't to eliminate all traces of your family's financial history from your psyche. That would be impossible and potentially harmful. Your ancestors' experiences are part of your story, and many of their survival strategies carry wisdom that can serve you when applied consciously rather than unconsciously. Instead, the goal is what trauma therapists call integration, developing the capacity to hold both your inherited patterns and your chosen direction simultaneously, making decisions from wisdom rather than from unconscious reactivity. This integration process requires ongoing attention and practice. Inherited trauma patterns have a tendency to resurface during times of stress, transition, or when you're pushing beyond your previous financial comfort zones. This isn't a sign of failure. It's a normal part of the healing process. Think of it like physical rehabilitation after an injury. Even after your body has healed, you might notice old injury patterns returning when you're tired or stressed. The same is true with inherited trauma patterns. They may reactivate periodically, especially during challenging times. The difference is that now you have awareness and tools to work with these patterns consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. You can recognize when inherited responses are being triggered and choose how to respond rather than automatically reacting. This ongoing process requires what I call financial mindfulness, the practice of staying present and aware during financial experiences, rather than operating on autopilot. This might involve pausing before making financial decisions to check in with your nervous system. Are you making this choice from wisdom or from inherited fear? Are you responding to your current reality or to your family's past reality? Financial mindfulness also involves regularly checking in with your relationship to money and wealth. How are you feeling about your financial situation? What patterns are you noticing in your financial behavior? Where might inherited programming be influencing your choices in ways you haven't recognized? The integration process is also supported by what trauma specialists call community healing. Inherited trauma isn't just individual, it's often collective, affecting entire communities that shared similar experiences. Connecting with others who are doing similar healing work can provide support, validation, and shared wisdom. This might involve joining groups focused on financial healing, working with therapists who understand generational trauma, or simply having honest conversations with friends and family members about inherited money patterns. Breaking the silence around these patterns is often part of breaking their power. As you continue this work, you may find that your relationship with money becomes increasingly aligned with your authentic values and desires, rather than with inherited fears and limitations. You might discover financial goals and possibilities that weren't even visible when you were operating from inherited programming. But perhaps most importantly, you'll likely develop what I call financial sovereignty, the capacity to make financial decisions from your own wisdom and values, rather than from unconscious inheritance or external pressure. This sovereignty becomes a foundation for creating sustainable wealth that serves not just your own life, but potentially the lives of future generations. The work of healing generational wealth trauma is ultimately about freedom. Freedom from unconscious patterns that limit your financial potential. Freedom to create wealth in alignment with your values. And freedom to pass down healthier patterns to future generations. This freedom doesn't mean you'll never face financial challenges or make financial mistakes. It means you'll face these experiences with greater awareness, resilience, and choice. You'll be responding to actual circumstances rather than to inherited ghosts from your family's past. As you move forward in this work, remember that healing happens in layers and cycles. You may think you've resolved a particular pattern only to have it resurface in a new form or context. This is normal and natural. Each layer of healing allows you to access deeper layers that weren't previously available. Be patient with yourself. Be compassionate with your family members who are still operating from inherited patterns. And remember that the work you're doing to heal these patterns is not just personal development. It's a form of service to your entire lineage, past and future. The patterns that once helped your ancestors survive can now be transformed into patterns that help you and future generations thrive. The sensitivity that made your family vulnerable to financial trauma can become intuition that guides wise financial decisions. The caution that once protected can become discernment that serves. Your willingness to face and heal these inherited patterns is itself an act of courage and love. Love for yourself, love for your ancestors who did their best with the resources they had, and love for future generations who will inherit the healthier patterns you create. Summary. We began this exploration with Sarah, checking her bank balance and feeling that familiar discomfort when her savings exceeded her unconscious comfort zone. We traced that discomfort back through generations to her grandmother Elena, who learned during the Great Depression that having too much was dangerous. Sarah's story illustrates the central truth we've explored. Your relationship with money was shaped not just by your personal experiences, but by the experiences of ancestors you may never have met. Through the mechanisms of epigenetic inheritance, family systems, and unconscious transmission, their survival strategies became your programming. We've seen how financial trauma can be literally inherited through altered gene expression, creating nervous system responses to money that operate below conscious awareness. We've explored how these inherited patterns manifest as financial comfort zones, money scripts, and automatic responses that can limit your financial potential in ways you don't even recognize. We've examined the common patterns that families pass down: scarcity inheritance that creates wealth guilt and compulsive giving, boom and bust inheritance that recreates cycles of financial instability, wealth shame inheritance that sabotages financial instability, wealth shame inheritance that sabotages financial success, and financial invisibility inheritance that leaves people feeling overwhelmed by basic money management. But understanding the problem is only the beginning. We've also explored how to break these cycles through developing witness consciousness, conducting financial archaeology to understand your family's patterns, and using somatic approaches to rewire your nervous system's responses to money. The healing work involves rewriting your money story consciously, rather than unconsciously repeating inherited narratives. It requires developing dual awareness, the ability to recognize inherited patterns without being controlled by them. And it demands financial self-compassion as you navigate the complex process of transforming generational programming. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how healing generational wealth trauma creates ripple effects that extend far beyond your personal financial life. The patterns you interrupt won't be passed to future generations. The healthier patterns you create become part of your family's new inheritance. This work isn't just personal development. It's generational healing that can transform entire family lineages. When you develop financial sovereignty, making decisions from wisdom rather than inherited fear, you create possibilities that may not have existed in your family for generations. The 7-year-old version of yourself that absorbed your family's relationship with money didn't have a choice about that programming. But you do have a choice now. You can continue operating from inherited patterns unconsciously, or you can bring awareness to these patterns and consciously choose which ones serve your current reality. Your ancestors did their best to survive and protect their families with the resources and understanding they had available. The patterns they created served important purposes in their contexts. Honoring their struggles doesn't mean you have to be limited by their solutions. You can carry forward the wisdom and resilience from your lineage while releasing the trauma and limitations. You can transform survival strategies into thriving strategies. You can heal not just your own relationship with money, but potentially the relationship your entire family lineage has with abundance and security. The invisible inheritance you received included both gifts and burdens. Through conscious healing work, you can keep the gifts while transforming the burdens into wisdom. The sensitivity that made your ancestors vulnerable to financial trauma can become intuition that guides wise financial decisions. The caution that once protected can become discernment that serves. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen once and then stay fixed forever. It's an ongoing process of conscious relationship with your inherited patterns and chosen direction. There will be times when old programming resurfaces, especially during stress or when you're expanding beyond previous comfort zones. But each time you choose awareness over unconsciousness, wisdom over inherited fear, you strengthen new neural pathways and weaken old ones. You become more free to create the financial life that aligns with your authentic values and desires, rather than your family's historical limitations. The work you do to heal generational wealth trauma is ultimately about love. Love for yourself, compassion for your ancestors who survived difficult circumstances, and care for future generations who will inherit the patterns you create. It's about transforming pain into wisdom, survival into thriving, and limitation into possibility. Your relationship with money doesn't have to be determined by your family's past. It can be consciously created to serve your present reality and future possibilities. The invisible inheritance you received can be transformed from limitation into liberation, from burden into blessing. The patterns end with you, and the healing begins with you. That 7-year-old at the kitchen table, absorbing messages about money and security, deserves to know that abundance is safe, that success is possible, and that they are worthy of all the wealth and prosperity their heart desires. Whether you absorbed every word of this exploration, or simply let it wash over you while attending to other tasks, your subconscious mind has been quietly integrating these insights about generational wealth patterns and inherited financial programs. The gentle frequencies woven throughout this audio continue their work even now, helping to dissolve old patterns that no longer serve you and installing new possibilities for abundance and financial freedom. Trust that this process of transformation is already beginning, operating at levels deeper than conscious thought. Your relationship with money is already shifting, becoming more aligned with your authentic desires rather than inherited limitations. If you found value in this exploration of generational wealth trauma, you might be interested in our other deep dives into the psychology of money and abundance. Until then, be gentle with yourself as these new patterns integrate, and remember that healing happens in its own perfect timing. The invisible inheritance you received is already transforming into conscious choice. The patterns that once limited your ancestors are becoming wisdom that serves your highest possibilities, and the financial freedom you deserve is already beginning to unfold.